Boundaries are important. We all seem to know that. And yet, they're difficult for most people to experience, to implement. They take lots of work, they're for our good, but they also require skill. I think, in my observation, most struggle at the point of implementing boundaries. For the most part, they may have an awareness of what their boundaries may be if they've gotten that far, but the real challenge is the implementation. And so stay tuned towards the latter part of this conversation. We're going to talk about some helpful measures in implementing boundaries, especially once you've actually created them. The title of our conversation today, Boundaries and Integrity, the courage to create and implement them. I think it's that whole circle that's really necessary. It's kind of like thinking of something wonderful like having a vehicle that you can't drive because you don't have the skills to. It's trying to go the whole gamut here with boundaries. How do we not only create them, but how do we also experience the benefits of them by implementing them? Boundaries define limits of acceptable and appropriate behavior in our lives, especially in relation to ourselves and community. It requires an awareness, a sense of self-awareness in what do we need to help protect our emotional and physical and mental well-being. There's a sense of self that is really important when we're considering boundaries. It's really actually quite critical to have this sense when you are trying to figure out what are your boundaries and how do you go about creating them. It helps us to communicate our expectations with those that we're in community with as well. Boundaries, some may feel that it's actually a selfish thing to have boundaries and to even think about actualizing them in our lives. But it's not about being selfish. It's more about taking responsibility for your own health and your own happiness and seeing how that works, especially while we're in community together. Now, boundaries take courage. It's a courageous thing to create and implement boundaries, especially the latter part of the implementation. That's a big part, like I say, in my observation that so many struggle with is in relation to the implementation. And so it takes courage, men, to even think about boundaries. I'm not sure. I think women do better. I think women do better at, in general, at creating boundaries and maybe even knowing how to implement them. Men, I think we struggle a bit more. I think we struggle a bit more just because it's unfamiliar territory and unfamiliar territory. Boundaries require courage, especially because it involves us standing up for ourselves and asserting our needs and our desires. Learning even how to say no is a really important part of seeing boundaries at work. It requires confronting quite a few fears on our end too, and this is where the courageous element comes in. You see, for so many, I'm not sure if you're like me, but there is that fear sometimes that we're going to disappoint others or that we're going to be rejected if we were to state our boundaries and to implement the consequences of those boundaries when they're crossed. It takes courage, however, to demonstrate our self-worth, doesn't it? At the very core, when we're advocating for ourselves, it's ourselves standing up and saying, hey, this is what I require, here's what I feel that I need, and when you do that, that's a courageous thing. A lot of people want to minimize their footprints. They want to minimize themselves, and so you'll see them coming into a room, for example, and they'll try to appear really small and take up as little space as possible so they don't inconvenience others. Boundaries require something different where you actually speak up for yourself and say, here's what I want, here's what I'm looking for, here's what my expectations are, here's what I want to see happening. And you're almost stating your own desires, your own needs, you're advocating for yourself. And that takes courage. That takes courage because it's, you're putting yourself out there. You're putting yourself out there in a very definitive way, and it's a challenge for a lot of people to do. Setting boundaries can be challenging. Oh, so challenging. Setting boundaries, just because I'm talking about the whole circuit here, not only from the creation, but also all the way through to the implementation of those boundaries in the consequences that you've drawn out. Those are all really important. But it can be challenging for a variety of reasons. One, so many of us culturally, we struggle with this fear of disappointing others. We don't want to disappoint. And so when we don't want to disappoint others. We may even get as far as stating our boundaries, and yet we just can't follow through on implementing the consequences when those boundaries are crossed. And that's because we just don't want to disappoint others. We're like, oh, like you'd rather do anything more horrible than to disappoint others, because that's just so difficult. I can relate. I've been there. I have so been there. So I'm with you on that one, if that's what you relate with. For others, it's perhaps a fear of negative reactions that others might have, and even confrontations where you're like, you just feel averse to like you don't like that energy when things get tense in the room and you can sense that things are at a disequilibrium and you are just on edge. That sense of confrontation, that sense of tension in the air is really difficult, and it's not your jam, and you want to avoid that at all costs. There's another one for a need for external validation, where you feel you want to be accepted, you want to be acknowledged by others. And so this need for external validation usually leads to you conforming your needs, your desires. You aren't able to state your boundaries because you're trying to assimilate, in essence, and conform to like the societal standards or the cultural standards perhaps. And so that's another difficult aspect. Speaking of cultural and societal norms, there's those norms culturally and societally that discourage and undermine setting of boundaries. I think of settings especially where the autonomy of the individual is not really present, because there's a lot more awareness and prioritization of the group dynamic. So in these settings, in my observation, there's a lot more sacrificing of oneself for the good of the whole. And that's a wonderful thing, but they do it to such an extent that they are not able to communicate or advocate for their own boundaries. And so there's really not a sense of self-autonomy, and that's a challenging thing. So the prioritization of oneself comes across as selfish, and it's highly discouraged. It's expressions of setting boundaries that may be perceived as selfish lead one to feel shame and guilt, and there's just an ostracization component as well too. If you don't play along with the norms culturally, you're gonna be on the periphery, if not on the outside of that societal norm or that cultural vantage point. There's also feelings of guilt for so many of us when we set boundaries, because we feel like when we prioritize our needs or desires, it's really selfish, and so we've been taught, don't be selfish, be selfless, give yourself sacrificially, take a hit for the team. So many ways that culturally we're coded to operate on this premise, where we are to give, and any sort of acceptance of what our needs might be and how we're going to go about fulfilling those, it's highly discouraged there too, and that's not helpful. That's not good. But there it is there. So there's that feeling of guilt when many advocate for what they feel their needs are. So those are some of the challenges that I came up with that sort of revolve around setting boundaries and the challenges therein. Now, integrity, which is the main thrust and theme of our platform, exploring it from many vantage points. Today we're exploring integrity as we consider what it looks like to set boundaries with integrity and the courageousness that it involves. And hence we're still in this sub-theme of courage as well, because setting boundaries, I mean, if you haven't done so, try it. It's a tough thing if you're unfamiliar with all these challenges. Like, if you're familiar with all these challenges, these fears that I shared with you just now, you can tell that this is not an easy thing. It's not for the faint of heart. Integrity is at the very foundation for setting good boundaries, especially setting them effectively, because to set your boundaries, there are so many components of walking in integrity that you have to be aware of. One, your deeply held values or your beliefs, your principles, things that really matter to you. That's the beginning point of walking in integrity, isn't it? To know so intimately those things that matter to you at a core level, at a deep level, that you're like, this is so important, and this is like my non-negotiables. Do you know what I'm saying? This is what you hold so tenaciously. You're like, this is really important. So that's the beginning point of integrity, is knowing what your internal values are, your moral framework. Here's what you really hold deeply. That's important because when you consider boundaries, your deeply held values, that's where it starts off with. That's how you start having an idea of what are those things that really matter to you, that you want to protect? What are those elements that you want to live by, that you want to honor and see actualized in your life? And how can you experience that, especially when you're in community with others? So critical, and to see how all these interplay with ourselves in community. I just mentioned some societal or cultural norms where it's like there's a higher priority, not for the autonomy of the individual like we have in the Western context, but more so a communal prioritization that says before our needs personally, we are going to acknowledge and address the needs of the group, in essence. And so that's where you see a lot of sacrificing for the sake of the group, which is wonderful, but I think it's really helpful when you have both a sense of one's internal commitments that really matter to them, and then also how they're going to fit in community as well. And that's what I believe integrity does at the very heart of it. Integrity, like I say, is the foundation for setting effective boundaries and implementing them as well. It starts off with those deeply held values, and then we know with our definition of integrity that it's not only the deeply held values that we hold on to, but seeing those align with our external actions. How consistent are we in behaving and acting out of those deeply held norms and commitments that we have internally? And then how consistent are we in doing all this? So integrity, let me just quickly recite the working definition that has really served me well so far as I have explored this theme of integrity, and that is, integrity is the consistent desire for one's internal values to match or align with their external actions while being true to themselves and respectful of others around them. I think that encapsulates so many components that are critical. There's you see yourself in community there when you're finishing that definition with the respectfulness of others. You're acknowledging others also have their own sense of integrity and what that looks like, and that they may have different perspectives and ideas from you. And so you're being respectful to their ideas while you're being true to your own. And you're doing all this while you're trying to align your internal framework with your actions. And you're doing this because you desire to do this, because you know that this is good for you and this is true. And you're doing this consistently because that's what really brings that sense of competence and compellingness to it. So we communicate our needs while we recognize the boundaries of others, which is that last part of the definition. Like I said, it's really important to see how this makes sense when we find ourselves in community. You wouldn't have any need for boundaries now, would you, if you were the only person in the world? You wouldn't have any need for boundaries because there's no one who's going to cross your boundaries. You can do as you please. You wouldn't have any need, furthermore, for integrity if you're the only person in the world, because it only makes sense when you are thinking in terms of yourself in the midst of others. How are you both going to, or how are we all going to work well with one another? And so these are important considerations when we think of the intersection between boundaries and integrity. Integrity really relying on one's alignments consistently of their moral framework internally with their actions externally. And you show what your convictions are by the way you act, right? That's a really good tell. You can, like, for example, someone who believes in respecting his fellow human beings, but who rips them apart, not only by gossip, but by verbally abusing them and sweat, like just a whole bunch of things. Their actions don't align with their stated values. And so there's a disconnect there that harms their display of integrity. But one who's aligned, who says, I want to respect people, and then they follow through on respecting them in the way that they connect and engage and even talk about those people, you see someone who is a lot more aligned in their value system that way. And so integrity really is the foundation of setting good boundaries, because boundaries are our way of communicating to those around us. Here is what my yes is, and here's what my no is, and here's how I want you to meet me in this space in the way that works for me. And then you also do that likewise for them, which is that full circle of integrity. So integrity, it's grounded, like when we pursue boundaries with integrity, it's really grounded in sincerity, because you're tapping into the deep reservoirs of what means a lot to you. You are pursuing honesty and communicating plainly and as simply as you can what your expectations are. And furthermore, it also exemplifies what respectfulness looks like, as you acknowledge that you're not the only one here who has something that really matters, right? Now, there are a few steps to implementing our boundaries. Here's where I'd love for you, if you have not been listening carefully, my dear young men, listen now, because this is the part that I would suggest so many struggle with. It's at this point here that you're going to find so many who struggle in some specific ways. The first step in implementing our boundaries is to be self-aware, to cultivate a self-awareness about yourself. This is also what's needed when you're starting off embarking with integrity. You are learning about yourself. Self-awareness is to be aware of what yourself is, like what your needs are, what your values are, what your commitments are, what your expectations, like these are all so critical and important for seeing boundaries being implemented. So it starts off with a sense of self-awareness, because here you're going to gain this deep understanding of your values and your needs, and you'll also be able to identify when these values and needs have been crossed. When your boundaries per se have been broken, you'll be able to know it because you have had self-awareness. And what self-awareness will do is self-awareness will give you that warning saying, uh-oh, something's wrong. It's kind of like that blinker, and you like the engine blinker, which says you need to check something out here. Something's out of whack. It's like the alarm's going off. If you're saying something's out of alignment here, it's like being in a building, whether a school or an office building, and you hear the fire alarm go off, and so that means we need to attend to that sound and to be aware that when we hear that sound, we need to do something that is going to help preserve us at the very core. And so this is the beginning part with this self-awareness, is you're going to know when those boundaries have been crossed. You'll know it because you're going to experience it. There is going to be a feeling. For example, when someone talks to you disrespectfully and they they actually dishonor you, like in a very clear way, you'll know a boundary has been hit because of the way you feel. The sense that you'll get from then is, that didn't feel good. And that kind of hurt. And I don't like that. And I want to address that because I don't want that to happen again. That's sort of the flow that comes from self-awareness. When you're aware of what's happening internally and how you're feeling based on boundaries being broken. And so it takes that sense of self-awareness that enables you to know what matters to you, what are your non-negotiables. And when I say non-negotiables, well, if you wonder why I'm making a fist, I heard this concept once and I found it really helpful. And it is that you have things in life that are in your open hand, and then there's things in your closed fist. The open hand things are things that you're, it doesn't really matter, but I mean, if you had to say, you would say something about it, but if it didn't get met, you'd be like, yeah, whatever. So that's your open hand thing. And then the closed hand or the closed fist thing is things that you're so these are things you don't want to let go. These are things that you are feeling are super important to you. It might be a project that you're working on that's long term. It might be a relationship and the principles of how that relationship entail. It might be an idea or a value. And so here what I'm talking about is those deeply held values that are in your closed hand that you're like, I can't let go of this. This is so important. For example, in the analogy I just had where someone disrespected and dishonored you in the way they're communicating with you. And your self-awareness is kicking into gear and giving you some input and feedback and saying, here's what this is feeling like. And then you're able to say, yeah, that's not good. And you're basing that because you're, first of all, self-aware of the values and the boundaries that you've communicated, hopefully, that enable you to communicate and say, okay, now that this has been broken, I don't like it, and I'm going to make a big stink about this. I'm going to see this being addressed in a way that is going to help serve me as well. And so that's really important. That's a really important component in that self-awareness, is knowing what are in your closed fist, because when you have those in the closed fist, like with the example I just gave, the value there would be that you believe we should all respect each other in the way we communicate. And when someone disrespects you in the way they communicate with you, that's a break of your boundary. And so you know how to move forward from then. But it's really important to start off at this place with this self-awareness of saying, I know now something is out of whack, and I'm going to address that. Secondly, communication. Communication is so important, especially in this realm here. It doesn't help to have a boundary. It doesn't help to even create a boundary and to never talk about it and articulate it and share it with those that needs to know. So this is almost like having a vehicle with no wheels. You can't go anywhere if your wheels are off the vehicle. Your wheels facilitate progression of the vehicle from point A to point B. In the same way, communication also helps to put your intentional boundaries that you're coming up with out there, and that's really important. That's really important, especially because it enables you to be in the present with those that you're in community with, to be able to clearly articulate and share with them, here's what works for me and here's what does not work for me. When they know, they have the skills now that are needed to get to that point in actually honoring your boundary. If they don't know because you never communicated your boundary to them, you can't hold them responsible. This is your way of passing that on and saying, this is important and I want you to attend to this. That's how that really flows in a consistent way forward. So when you communicate, it's really important to be unapologetic about your boundaries. If you're coming and communicating your boundaries saying, I'm really sorry, but I don't want you to do this, that's almost taking away the power of your boundary. Because now they're saying he's apologetic, so he must not mean that, this boundary is that important to him if he's apologetic. Boundaries, when you're communicating them, communicate them clearly, communicate them respectfully, but be assertive in the way you communicate them. Be very clear, be very respectful, but also be assertive in the way you communicate them. So an example would be, I do not like it when you speak to me this way. When you speak to me, I'm requesting that you speak to me with respect. Otherwise, our communication is going to be addressed and we're going to have to move to a consequence of what this looks like, and then you can go into telling what the consequences are. That's a boundary that is communicated clearly. You're saying, I do not like this and I don't want to experience this again. You're doing that respectfully. You're not yelling at them and saying, you idiot, why are you talking to me like this? You're being very logical. You're being very direct and clear, saying, I don't like it when you do this. Please don't do this anymore. And here's the consequences of what are going to happen should you do this. You're being very clear, you're being very respectful, you're being very assertive. It empowers you to protect your emotional, your mental, your physical well-being. It helps you maintain your autonomy and your self-respect as well. That self-respect piece comes especially when you know that you're not doing this apologetically. You don't have to apologize for stating your boundaries. Actually, that's your right to do so and to communicate and put that out there. There's also another component which I've been harping on for such an extended season now, especially in relation to integrity, but it also matters with boundaries, and that is consistency. Consistency is another critical component because with consistency, boundaries are maintained and reinforced, especially in their importance and their non-negotiable nature. When you maintain consistency in keeping your boundaries, you're saying, I'm not letting this go, and this is still important to me, and I want you to meet me in a consistent way on this point right here, whatever that point is that you want to state your boundaries. So that consistency is really important because it prevents the mixed messages. Could you imagine if you stated a boundary and you only implement it once in a while? Like you tell someone, don't talk to me disrespectfully, I do not like that. And then the next time they do that, you don't say anything. And then the next time they do it, you don't say anything. And then the next time they do it, you say, hey, don't talk to me like that. I don't like this, right? And then another 3 times they disrespect you or communicate disrespectfully, and then you don't do anything. That's inconsistency on display there, and that creates a lot of mixed messages, because what you're saying did not line up with what you're expecting, and you're not following through and implementing that consistently. So it establishes this sense of reliability with yourself, saying, I don't ever tolerate this kind of communication, so don't do it. I don't ever do it, so every time it happens, I'm going to make a big deal about it, and I'm going to let you know that's off balance. That's a really important part. But it also helps you maintain that sense of reliability, not only with yourself, because you know you're always going to make a point about it, but you're also going to do that. You're going to establish that reliability with others. When you keep on saying to them, no, that's a no-go zone, and I told you that that's a no-go zone. So I'm going to keep on making that point until I have to implement my boundaries, especially where a break may be necessary. Now we get to the implementation part. This is the part I would suggest where so many of us young men, actually people in general, but I'm speaking to young men specifically, we struggle is in this implementation part. It's so tough to implement. It takes energy to implement. It takes follow through and consistency, but when we implement, we're advocating for ourselves with confidence and assertiveness. We're saying, no, it's still not good when you do this, or when you say that, or whatever it is. You want to implement consistently. You want to follow through on this. You want to show that your boundaries are important and that they are non-negotiable, and you want to be met at that space there, and that they're to be taken seriously. When you don't do this, people don't take you seriously, and they keep on blowing you off, or they keep on breaking those boundaries, and they don't honor you. They don't take you seriously enough to say, you're not a person of your word. You're not a man of your word, in essence. And so implementation, so critical, so huge. And it takes courage, doesn't it, to implement. It's an uncomfortable thing. I mentioned earlier how some people are very averse to confrontation. They try to avoid it at all costs. They don't want to experience confrontation. And yet it's so important for us to walk through the implementation, because this is how where the rubber meets the road in this whole cycle of creating and maintaining our boundaries. When we show that our boundaries are important and we follow through on the commitments and the aftermath, it's so important to acknowledge and see this component of implementation. And then a final piece I want to bring in is the empathy piece as well too. Some would say that when they try to work through their boundaries, it feels really selfish, and that they're only asking for their things to be attended to without any awareness of what the other party might need. But empathy is a really big part of this, and this is why I say we want to talk about boundaries, setting boundaries with integrity. Boundaries and integrity kind of go in hand, especially because both have to do with us in community, and also both have to do with us honoring, respecting others in our space too. So for example, if you say you're going to be somewhere at a certain time and you are late and you don't follow up with them and say, hey, I'm going to be late, by the way, just so you know, and they're sitting there waiting, there's like a break of a boundary there where you're breaking someone's time frame, like their time that they've set and allotted for you. That's a potential idea of how a boundary can be broken. But the empathetic piece comes where you're saying, this other individual is different from me. They have their own values. They also have their own boundaries, for example. What does it look like for me to engage in and connect with this person from a premise whereby they feel like they've been heard, they feel like they are being acknowledged, and you also feel the same way, that you're feeling heard and acknowledged. For some people, they think this is not possible because we have such different ideas and this is going to happen, we're going to butt heads. But there is a way that we can actually connect really well and deeply when we consider the empathy piece and saying, okay, this person is different, so I'm gonna listen to their perspective. I may not necessarily agree with it, but I'm still gonna make space for them to express it and to be in that space. And it fosters this environment where both sides, like I say, feel heard and they also feel respected as well. So I guess to finish, boundaries, it requires courage, doesn't it? Again, the subtitle was The Courage to Create and Implement Boundaries. It's important. It's important because when you do so, you're able to walk into who you truly are and what you're made for. Creating and implementing boundaries with integrity is a courageous act. It is not for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of mind commitment because you're trying to make sure you're Your values align with your actions, especially so you can communicate what your needs are in the midst of that space. And that takes a lot of work to, one, look at yourself in the mirror and say, hey, what does this look like for me to walk with integrity, to be consistent, to have my actions and my words aligned so that when I can communicate the boundaries, I know exactly where I'm going to. I know that it's really important for me to experience respect from those that I'm interacting with. It's really important for me, for example, to be myself and not to be constrained, not to have others say, please don't do this, or say, like, I want to be me. I want to be what it means to me in the full sense. So creating and implementing these boundaries with integrity, courageous for sure, it empowers our well-being, establishes our healthy relationships with others. When you set boundaries, you are in essence telling others, here's where I want you to meet me and here's how this is going to work well, which fosters this beautiful space for growth in that friendship and that relationship. Setting boundaries that align with our values, that we enforce and implement because we're committed to integrity and keeping our word, that when we say something, we're going to do it. This all brings us to experience deeper personal growth and deeper connections with those that we're in community with. Boundaries, if you haven't already done so, young men, I would encourage you to consider even that blueprints, that brief blueprint. And let me just recite them again for you. One, to start off with self-awareness. How aware are you of your values and the non-negotiables that you have? How are you communicating based on those values your needs to others around you? Your yeses and your nos. You know, boundaries really help you to learn how to say that tough word, no. And that's a tough thing because you've been taught, like I have, to always be giving, to always serve and serve, even at your detriment. And then there's not only the communication piece, but there's also consistency. How consistent are you in your walk and your commitments to your boundaries, and how well do you implement them on a regular, consistent basis to ensure that you're being taken seriously? And then finally, the empathy piece. Remember that you're dealing with others who have their own value systems, and you want to honor and respect them for theirs, even when you don't even when you do disagree with them. So these are all some really important parts. Friends, if you haven't already done so, if you are getting benefit from this content, do subscribe to the channel and be a part of this movement that I am hoping to see progressing, where we are gathering because of our mutual interest in walking in integrity. And today we've been talking about boundaries and what that looks like in the midst of all that. I will see you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching till the very end. I appreciate you guys. Bye for now.